Hello friends! Today, let's dive into one of the eeriest and most mysterious places on Earth, Nahani Valley in Canada, more commonly known as the Valley of the Headless. So, we find ourselves in the northern regions of Canada, specifically the Northwest Territories. This vast, almost uninhabited area is home to only about 50,000 people. It boasts extensive wilderness, cloaked in dense forests, towering mountains, broad rivers, serene lakes, and sprawling swamps. Nestled within these inhospitable lands lies Nahani Valley, covering a staggering 18,000 square kilometers. Since 1976, it has been designated a national park, but don't let that fool you. There are no established trails, tourist attractions, or even proper roads here. The only way to reach the valley is by chartering a private plane, navigating the tumultuous river with its rapids, or undertaking a long and perilous trek through the forests that could take weeks. It's a remote yet breathtakingly beautiful place. The wilderness of Nahani Valley remains largely untouched by human influence and has preserved its pristine nature. Human presence is nearly non-existent, with only a few rare rangers at the park's edges, and hunters or tourists rarely venture into the valley. Local indigenous tribes tend to avoid the area, considering these lands cursed. Now let's explore the sources behind the ominous reputation of this valley. We'll start with some known facts. The first documented case dates back to 1898 when a group of 6 prospectors set out to find gold in the valley. It was the peak of the gold rush. The gold in California was running out, and the frenzy had shifted to Yukon, Klondike, and Alaska. People were obsessed with finding gold, but by this time many were already combing through available sites in Yukon and Alaska. Thus, it made sense to search in wild, uncharted territories where untouched deposits might exist. However, these 6 prospectors vanished without a trace, and back then, this didn't raise too many eyebrows. People went missing in remote areas of Canada quite regularly, and no one bothered to look for them. A few years later, a hunter who inadvertently stumbled into the valley made a bizarre discovery. The remnants of the prospectors' camp, where skeletons were found clutching their weapons, but without heads. The skulls were neatly placed at their feet, yet even these bizarre facts failed to unsettle anyone. It was declared that animals must have feasted on the bodies, and the heads had separated in the process. A small mention of the incident appeared in a Yukon newspaper, but it didn't even include the names of the victims. Now, let's move on to the second incident that we know more about. In 1904, 3 brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLoud, decided to try their luck searching for gold in Nahani Valley as well. By that time, the gold rush was already waning, with many active mining sites around. The brothers logically assumed that the sparsely populated valley might still harbor untouched deposits. After a long and arduous journey using dog sleds and homemade boats, they finally reached Nahani Valley and found themselves on the Flat River, which flows through the area. The name Flat might be misleading, as the river is anything but smooth. It's turbulent and filled with rapids. The brothers disembarked, set up camp, and began their search for gold by installing sluices in the streams, special constructions that filter nuggets from the river flow. Once they set up the sluices, the brothers realized the river was teeming with gold. For several days they worked diligently, panning through the sand, and managed to accumulate a significant amount of precious metal. However, eager to return to town as quickly as possible to file their claims and secure their rights to the site, they loaded their gold into the boat and set off down the river. But as they navigated one of the rapids, the boat crashed into a rock and shattered, sweeping away most of their supplies and gold. Fortunately, the brothers made it to the shore unharmed. With dwindling food supplies, they couldn't mine any more gold, so they soon built a new boat and left the valley empty-handed. Upon returning home, the 2 younger brothers, Willie and Frank, began plotting a return to Nahani Valley. However, their older brother Charlie was not keen on the idea, having been traumatized by their near-drowning experience in the river. He declared that he had no intention of going back. So the brothers invited their friend Robert Weir, who agreed to join them in their quest for gold. In the spring of 1905, they returned to the valley, while Charlie stayed in town, waiting for their return. A month went by, then 6 months, then a year, yet Charlie remained unconcerned. In those days it was common for people to leave home for extended periods. and he assumed the brothers had struck it rich and were busy extracting their fortune. When 2 years had passed, Charlie began to worry and organized a search party. He and 4 others traversed the entire route along the flat river, but there were no signs of his brothers. Their adventure took them through vast canyons with caves that had never seen human feet. Finally, they noticed a white spot on the shore. As they approached, they discovered the headless body of a man lying in front of a tent. Part of his clothing was torn and his arm was outstretched toward a rifle, which was neatly propped against a tree. Upon entering what remained of the tent, they found a second headless body. Charlie was able to identify his brothers by their personal belongings. However, the third prospector, Robert Weir, was missing from the camp. A few months later, downstream, some skeletal remains were found, leading to speculation that it might have been Robert, although forensic examinations were not conducted at that time. The reasons for these events remained a mystery. The only clue was a mysterious inscription on a tree: "We found a great vein." However, there was no gold to be found in the camp, no sluices, no signs of mining. The official police conclusion stated that all 3 men had died of starvation, with animals taking their heads afterward. Charlie McLoud publicly condemned this explanation, asserting that he saw burnt clothing on the bodies. He believed that local tribes had attacked them, but the police rejected this theory. Rumors about this story grew into myths, and people began to believe that the brothers indeed found gold, and Robert, unwilling to share, had eliminated his companions, but ultimately drowned in the river himself. Rumors about Nahani Valley began to gain traction, and this mystical reputation led to it being dubbed the Valley of the Headless. However, beyond fear, this tale also captured the imagination of prospectors, who started to regard it as Canada's El Dorado. In 1913, a gold seeker named Martin Jorgenson decided that he wouldn't let the grim legends stand in his way to wealth. He tackled the challenging hike to the flat river and built a small cabin, intending to explore the gold deposits before meeting up with his partners in the town of Yellowknife to discuss his findings. However, just a few days after completing the cabin, he boarded his boat and floated down the river to the nearest outpost, where he sent a letter to his partners announcing his sudden wealth. His words inspired his companions to prepare for an expedition the following year. But summer passed, and there was still no word from Martin. They decided to hire an indigenous guide and headed upstream on the flat river to the spot where Martin was supposed to be, according to his last letter. Ultimately, they found his cabin. However, sadly, it had burned to the ground. Nearby the ruins lay the remains of a man. Jorgenson's partners thoroughly searched the area for any gold, but found nothing. The police again concluded that it was an accident, quickly closing the case, but the incident drew attention to the valley. And now we move on to the next, 4th incident. 7 years later in 1921, an experienced hunter named John O'Brien was found frozen in Nahani Valley. He sat before a roaring campfire, not in the posture of someone freezing, but with a calm expression on his face. In his hand was a matchbox, as if he had simply sat down to warm himself by the fire when something suddenly froze him in that position. Those who found him claimed it looked as though he had been instantaneously frozen. His head was still intact, and it didn't surprise anyone that hunters in northern Canada frequently succumbed to the cold. In 1926, a stranger incident occurred. A girl named Mela Ferdy went missing during a hunt in the same valley. Mela was a cousin of the hunter Paul Field's wife. That summer she accompanied Paul, his wife Mary, and a group of indigenous people from Fort Simpson on a hunting expedition. The group had just spent the winter setting traps for fur-bearing animals in the Mackenzie Mountains, and was heading to trading posts along the Laird River. Mela and her relatives were Metis, who led the expedition and gathered pelts for their livelihood. However, at a river that would later be named Mary River in honor of Paul's wife, the girl suddenly vanished. At first, everyone thought she had simply gone to the restroom and got lost. Paul and 5 hunters set out to find her. All of them were experienced trackers and quickly picked up her trail. Paul and his companions pursued Mela for a total of 9 days. Along the way, they stumbled upon remnants of her torn clothing hanging from tree branches, suggesting that the girl had gradually shed her clothes in her frantic escape, leaving her unprotected from mosquitoes. This series of events prevented them from locating her. Eventually, they called off the search, citing that without clothing she would freeze within a few nights. But this story didn't end there. The incident was reported in local newspapers. An indigenous hunter named Big Charlie approached the police with a statement. He told them that while hunting in the valley near the third canyon, he had set up camp by the flat river, and, late that evening, was awakened by the sound of a rock falling into the water. By moonlight, he saw a naked girl 100 yards away. She was on all fours and suddenly took off running down a steep cliff. Charlie described her movement as animalistic. But what struck him the most was the expression on her face when she occasionally stopped and looked back in wonder. He described her grimace as a grin, her eyes wide open and filled with madness. The police didn't believe the indigenous man and didn't conduct a more thorough investigation, but the creek where Mayla went missing became known as May Creek. Let's continue. Perhaps one of the most colorful characters in the Valley of the Headless was Yukon Fisher. This man succumbed to gold fever, made his way to the Klondike, and roamed around Yukon until in one of the saloons he got into an argument with the bartender and smashed his head with a bottle. Prospector Billy Clark recalled, "There was blood everywhere. Fisher was sure he had killed the guy, so he ran off into the woods." Hammer Sandpeters added, "He lived in complete isolation, avoiding contact with both indigenous people and whites. Occasionally, this 2-meter-tall hermit, dressed in animal skins, was seen at remote trading posts, such as at Paul Field's store, where he would stock up on tea, salt, matches, and ammunition before vanishing back into the wilderness." Paul Field claimed that Fisher developed a peculiar wild animal sense from his primitive lifestyle and could easily distinguish between the sounds made by moose, caribou, bears, and humans. However, the end of his life remains a mystery. Incident number 6 occurred in 1929 when 3 prospectors once again set out in search of gold. It seems they hadn't learned from past experiences. The trio consisted of George Gilroy, Eddie Hay, and Angus Hall. After setting up camp at the mouth of Scow Creek, they attempted to mine for gold but soon found themselves in conflict, leading Angus to storm off into the woods in a fit of anger. Later that same evening, his companions noticed him climbing up a nearby cliff. The friends expected him to return once he calmed down, so when morning arrived without Hall's presence, they didn't panic right away. Deciding to continue their search upstream along Bennett Creek, they soon discovered a single footprint left by the missing companion. Gilroy and Hay encountered another group of 4 prospectors, shared lunch, and continued their fruitless search for Hall, but his body was never found. A year after his disappearance, a hunter named Phil Powers arrived in Nahani Valley. Described by acquaintances as an honest and experienced hunter, Phil Powers built a cabin at the mouth of Irwin Creek and began setting traps. A few months later, a group of hunters stumbled upon deserted traps containing the remains of lynxes and foxes just a few kilometers from the burnt cabin of the Jorgenson family. At the confluence of the Caribou and Flat Rivers, they found the wreckage of Powers' canoe. Finally, they made their way to the mouth of Irwin Creek and, after hiking, reached the site of Phil's cabin, which had also been completely destroyed by fire. Among the ashes, they discovered charred bones belonging to the hunter. Conflicting accounts exist regarding the state of his remains. Some say Powers was found headless, holding a single-shot revolver, while others claim his skull was discovered at his feet. The investigation once again attributed the incident to a faulty stove. However, the hunters believed that someone shot Powers while he lay in his bed and then set fire to the cabin. Incident number 8 took place in December 1935. Dogmusher Joe Dalziel led 2 fur hunters, Joe Mulholland and Bill Appler, into the valley. The hunters went missing. Later, the brother of one of them hired Dalziel as a guide to organize a search. Dalziel took the group to the spot where he had dropped off the hunters months earlier. Nearby, they found the remains of a cabin that, like the previous ones, had been burned to the ground. In May 1936, a group of hunters found a campsite at the confluence of the Flat and Nahani rivers, which, as later determined, had been used just a few days prior. Traveling down the South Nahani River, they came across several trees that had been cut down with axes. Since Mulholland and Appler could have been the only people in the area, they concluded that these were the hunters' tracks. The following winter, 2 hunters, L. Lewis and Harry Vandal, entered the valley and encountered a series of strange camps. Lewis described them as shelters, each containing a piece of neatly folded tarpaulin and various items, ranging from empty tobacco cans to a dried wolf's paw. The disappearance of the 2 hunters sparked various rumors, but ultimately no further traces were found. In the autumn of 1946, prospector Frank Henderson returned from Nahani Valley with a bag containing 30 ounces of gold and a chilling story. That season, he had planned to explore mineral sites with his friend John Patterson. They were supposed to meet in Virginia Falls in the spring of 1946 and then head together to Watson Lake. Henderson made his way through the Northwest Territories on dog sleds, accompanied by a group of 5 indigenous guides, while Patterson traveled east across the Mackenzie River. According to their agreement, they left messages carved into trees for each other. Henderson arrived at their meeting point first, and when Patterson was late, he left a message on a tree before setting off deeper into the valley, assuming Patterson would catch up with him. On his first night in the valley, Henderson was awakened by a strange howling. They had set up camp on a rock near the water, and Henderson noticed that his indigenous companions were awake and seemed very frightened. They gestured for him to stay quiet and quickly extinguished the fire by covering it with a pot. The eerie sound, resembling wailing, persisted for several hours. When everything finally quieted down, Henderson asked the guides what was happening, and they told him they had seen white giants near the river. His guides were clearly terrified and immediately decided to leave the valley, veering off their planned route eastwards instead of continuing down the South Nahani. It was at this point that Henderson found a message from Patterson carved into a tree, stating that his partner had entered the Nahani Valley. Henderson pleaded with the guides to return, but they were too frightened and convinced him to go with them. Patterson vanished without a trace, and no evidence of him was ever found. In 1957, Leonard Brunchnick set out to find the lost McLoud gold mine in Nahani Valley. A few months later, his body was discovered on the banks of the South Nahani, face down in a pool of his own blood. In 1962, pilot Angus Blake Mackenzie disappeared while flying over the valley. He was searched for 40 days, but neither he nor his plane was ever located. That same year, pilot Kenneth Stockwell and 3 passengers, Victor Gooden, Gunther Hertz, and Henry Bueza, were flying through Nahani. A month later, the wreckage of Stockwell's plane and the body of Victor Gooden were found near Virginia Falls. The bodies of Stockwell, Hertz, and Bueza were never recovered. On June 22, 1963, 3 Swiss men, Martin Wuthrich, Fritz Weissmann, and Wolfgang Minka, canoed down the river into Nahani Valley. In early August, a patrol discovered Martin Wuthrich's body lying at a rapid known as the Horseshoe. His body was remarkably well preserved due to the icy water, however the cause of death could not be determined. It appeared he died before he drowned. Weissmann and Minka were never found. In 1978, an expedition led by American paranormal researcher Hank Mortimer set off for Nahani Valley. His team was well prepared, equipped with weapons, radios, and modern gear. Upon arrival, they reported a broken camp and their intention to venture deeper into the valley. However, distressing cries from radio operator Ray Wilson soon echoed, "There's nothing coming out of the rock! It's horrific!" After which communication was cut off. An alarm was raised, and a helicopter with armed personnel landed at the site 30 minutes later, but no people or traces of the camp were found. One of the most recent incidents occurred in 2005 when 60-year-old David Horsey and his friend Frederick Hardesty went into the valley for a weekend trip. The men disappeared, prompting a search that lasted nearly a month. David's body was later found in dense brush, almost 4 kilometers from the cabin, while Frederick was discovered in the North Nahani River, about 20 kilometers from the hut. Investigators stated that Horsey died of hypothermia and that Hardesty drowned. However, David's brother, who participated in the search, claimed there were strange findings at the cabin. There were signs of gunfire everywhere and numerous clues that the police ignored. "We found my brother's shirt with a large hole that looked like a bullet wound, but the police said there was nothing criminal about it." The victims' families attempted to have the investigation reopened, but they were denied. These are just a few incidents from Nahani Valley, also known as the Valley of the Headless. Throughout its history, over 50 people have disappeared in this region, with many found headless, or with their heads placed by their feet. It should be noted that since 1972, this area has been included in Nahani National Park. There is no gold mining or hunting allowed, only tourists visit in the summer, and only with experienced guides. Deviations from designated routes are strictly prohibited, and all visitors are carefully recorded in logbooks. Since that year, no one has disappeared or died under unexplained or mysterious circumstances in the park. In our next episode, we'll delve into what could be happening in this mysterious area. We will explore the history of the valley, the folklore of indigenous peoples, and of course discuss the numerous theories that exist. This episode promises to be truly fascinating, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I would love to read your theories in the comments about what might be occurring in the valley. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. They will find it interesting too.